TFM.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, our dedicated Star Trek Enterprise podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I just have this feeling that we're going to be very happy that you brought those heavy blankets with you today, because I've got a bad feeling about this.
Well, Chris, I'm very glad that we did, and I'm also glad that we brought the bourbon, so...
Well, we got to have bourbon. Always got to have bourbon around.
Yeah, I mean, it's 5 o'clock. Oh, no, it's past 5 o'clock here. So, yeah, we're good.
Well, we're going to need it today as we talk about the episode Shuttlepod One as we continue our 20th anniversary rewatch of Star Trek Enterprise. And here's a quick recap of the story. While on a mission to survey an asteroid field, Trip and Malcolm come across some debris from Enterprise, part of a launch bay door that was damaged during a rescue mission. Assuming that the Enterprise has been destroyed and that they are now stranded in deep space, the two begin working on a plan to get to safety, but they begin to spiral into despair, a little bit of disagreement, and some fun chatter as air runs low and they begin to doubt their survival. So, Matthew, let me ask you this question. It's not the first item on the outline. However, in giving that synopsis, I started wondering, did they jump the gun in thinking that the Enterprise was destroyed in the first place? And is that the first thought that would have come into your head in that situation?
You know, I don't know if it's the first thought, but I was thinking about this, about the episode, because it is a really pivotal part of the episode itself, and it doesn't seem all that odd to me that they would jump to this conclusion when, one, they aren't able to contact anybody, and two, for them, space is so big. And so, To see that wreckage and then think, the Enterprise is destroyed, I don't know, it doesn't seem that implausible. And I've got to put myself in the mindset that this is them first venture out into space. So, a more seasoned person might not, but, for them, this is definitely a first.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that if it happened to Starfleet officers in later Star Trek series, later on the timeline, yeah, they'd probably start trying to figure out what happened other than the ship being destroyed. Like, maybe theirs would be reversed, like, surely the ship couldn't be destroyed, so what's going on here? And then try to unravel it that way. But for Trip and Malcolm, yeah, I think it makes sense. And it's yet another way of highlighting here in season one the newness of space exploration for humans. But, what a feeling, though. You look down there and you think your ride is gone. And if you're Trip, you're thinking, oh man, I'm just going to have to find my way to another planet, some kind of safety, while I listen to Malcolm wallow in despair all the way,
I love that you said that, because dude, where's my ride?
Right.
is where they kind of are. But I do think it's really interesting because, one of the things about this episode is it is, character study, and it really does kind of give us a taste of what these characters are like when facing death, like when they know that the end is coming. And I think that's a really, it makes for a really interesting opportunity to get a chance to know these characters in a way that we don't before. And obviously, one of the things that this is a budgetary thing. It allows them to bring down the cost of season one because they don't have to pay a ton for this episode. So much of it just takes place on sets that already exist, and there's not a ton of effects work. And so this allows them to be able to tell, I think, a really important story moving forward for these characters without breaking the bank.
Right. Well, that's what stands out to me is that, like you said, they did this story to lower the overall budget of the season. And I think it highlights something that often gets lost in modern television, which is that you don't have to just throw money at creative work all the time. Like every episode of a science fiction show does not have to have cinematic quality special effects going off every 3 minutes. This really shows how working with a limited budget, trying to figure out how can we tell a story and save money at the same time so that we can use that money for other stories within the season where we need to do it, particularly with it being season 1 of any show like this. They spend a lot of money on the pilot. That's always expensive. And the result is we get this wonderful character story. We get these great results from the writers and the actors. And we don't need to spend a lot of money. And there are no extras in here. I think this is the only episode of Star Trek that has no extras at all. It's just the main crew. And we don't even see Travis. Mm-hmm. So, one of the main crew is not even on the screen at all. And we just get these wonderful results.
Well, and I think one of the fun things about this episode, kind of before, so most of it takes place, with Trip and Malcolm. But one of the fun things I thought that they did in this episode was kind of flip the script to Paul and Archer, in that it's Archer now not believing in something that the Vulcans do, so the idea of microsingularities, humans think that's impossible and Vulcans don't, whereas, Vulcans think time travel is impossible and humans don't. So I thought that was a really fun story element because they found a great way for the little bit that they're on screen to tell a fun story with those two characters that kind of like helps with their relationship and their banter without giving them a lot of time. And so that was, I thought, one of the smartest things they did. And it's such a very small, piece of the episode.
Right. So now we can play a game, Matthew. Which is less plausible? Microsingularities or time travel? Which one do you not believe in?
Well, Chris, the Vulcan Science Institute says that time travel is impossible, and apparently, I don't know what institute on Earth says microsingularities are impossible, but I think Vulcans are what's impossible. So, how about
Vulcans
that?
are impossible. But they're right in front of you, Matthew. You can see the Vulcans. They're right there. I still don't believe in Vulcans.
Nope.
What a timely story that would be for the world we're living in today. All right. Okay, well, let's talk about Trip and Malcolm a little bit, because the other thing that most stands out to me in this story, and I think it does for most viewers, is the fact that talking matters. This is the other thing that I think has kind of slipped away in Star Trek, is that great things happen when you put two actors together on the screen and you let them talk to each other for an extended period of time.
I mean, I don't know if I could say it better, because the thing that drives many of the best Star Trek episodes of all time are conversations people having in a room. And what's interesting about that is that it really harkens back to movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Where, especially the 40s, where you're not having a large amounts of special effects in films because it's not possible, and the cost, obviously. So really, movies are about people talking in rooms. And I think this really helps us understand how, it's one of the reasons theater works too, right? You can have a fantastic play with very minimal sets if you have incredible actors delivering great dialogue and diving into the human condition. And that's what's so great about this episode, is that it gives us an opportunity to explore the human condition and what people are like when they face the ultimate of humanity, the thing that defines us, which is that our lives do end. And how do we face that? And, Malcolm and Trip are two completely different characters who look at the world differently. And so to have them in this kind of like titanic struggle together and kind of find a way through discussion to a place where they understand one another better and they appreciate one another more and have a better respect for one another is phenomenal. And in many ways, I mean, like, isn't that what makes Star Trek so important, is the ability for us to have a conversation with someone that we might not agree with and hopefully in the end come away with a better understanding. And like you said, that's something that's kind of been lost because it feels like the storytelling today is so much more about like telling us what we should think about a thing, and instead of allowing characters to come together and be able to move in a different direction without necessarily saying one or another character is wrong. And that's something that this episode doesn't do either. It just allows both of the characters to be who they are, and it's not really judging either one, but it just allows us to be a part of their lives.
Yeah, exactly. There is earlier Star Trek, TOS, TNG, where I suppose the narrative of the story tells us what we're supposed to think about a situation, because that's what you and I love about DS9 is they got away from that and they started showing you the gray and different characters having different viewpoints, different things happening, and you not always, or different viewers not always coming away with the same lesson from the story, right? So in that sense, stories have been like that before, like telling us what we're supposed to think. But like you're talking about modern Star Trek and other TV as well. Again, I hate to keep coming back to it because we keep coming back to it, but the short nature of the seasons these days, I think, create a lot of this problem where we don't get to sit down with the characters like this, and the story is just dragging us along. And you hear fans a lot these days talking about, well, we don't know anything about this character or the bridge crew on Discovery, for example. And a big reason is because we don't get stories like this one where I started to say there's nothing big at stake. There is something big at stake, of course. They might both die, so that's pretty big. But in the big scheme of life in the galaxy, there's nothing big at stake. It's just for the two of them.
Well, when the stakes are much more understandable for us as human beings, like
we can relate to it, right?
Yeah. And it's not like universe ending, like things to which, you don't really have time when the universe is about to end in 20 minutes to have long, deep conversations. And I think, that's what makes this so beautiful, is that they have nothing but time until they die.
Right.
Like there's nothing for them to be doing. And so that is the kind of Titanic struggle, is how they're going to both spend that time and whether or not they're going to kill each other before they get there.
Well, I think the ability to relate to the characters in the situation is important. And then the things that they talk about are things that we can also relate to. And for me, one of the reasons I love Star Trek, and it's been an important part of my life, and it has shaped who I am for 49 years now, is that when characters sit down and talk to each other, and we got this a lot in the original series with Kirk, Spock, and Bones in particular, especially Kirk and Spock talking to each other. We got it with Picard a lot in The Next Generation, and many other characters throughout the franchise, they talk about things that we experience in our own lives, and therefore we can relate to those things. And they talk about them at length, and it makes us think about the same questions. How would we react in a situation like Trip and Malcolm find themselves in here? What would we think reflecting back on our lives? What would we think about past relationships with friends or family or lovers? Or how would we feel if we knew we were near the end and we have regrets, or we're thinking about things in a positive way? Who knows? But just the fact that we're able to do that watching this story is what stands out to me as highlighting why the story is loved by fans so much, why it's largely considered to be the best episode of season 1 by many people, and it tends to get the highest ratings when you ask people to rate episodes.
Well, and I think part of that too is that fans love knowing more about characters.
Yeah.
Because that's how we grow to love them. Like, if we don't know anything about them, it's hard to really love them. You know, I was, doing the interview for Literary Treks with Alex White, and we were talking about Deep Space Nine because, he wrote the book Revenant about Dax. And
new book.
One of the hallmarks of Deep Space Nine is its characters and how much we know about so many of the characters. And I think that's kind of what makes this type of episode special, is because you come away from it and you feel like, oh, I understand and know who Malcolm is in a way that I didn't before. And this episode has also kind of reinforced a lot of things that we knew about Trip, but at the same time, I think also shown us some things we didn't know. One of the things I love that we learn about him is that, he was legitimately willing to sacrifice his life so that Malcolm could live, because that's what he thought was, he didn't want to take up any more air in the room. So, and I thought, that's a small thing, but it also just kind of lets us know who this character is. And moving forward, that is going to be really important for how this character grows, because we're going to see him in a lot of situations where he is going to have to put his life on the line. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was one of the things that really again, it's one of those small little nuggets you pick up on, but it helps you know that character better.
Yeah, it's making me think also about how in season 1, the characters were learning how to be space explorers, how to be Starfleet officers, because Trip's response to the situation is more in line with what we're accustomed to for Starfleet officers. We've seen earlier in the season Hoshi's fear of being in deep space, and now we're seeing it in Malcolm as well. Maybe not a fear of being in deep space in general, but a fear of being in a situation where he really doesn't have much control over what's happening to him, and it's a life or death situation. And digging deeper, unpeeling Malcolm here, as we do in this episode, in that situation, we see kind of pessimism and sorrow take over his thoughts and his actions in a way that we don't generally see from Starfleet officers. And that is another highlight of the growth of humanity, I guess, into that Star Trek future, which again makes this a great prequel series. And it does it through, although this episode is quite loved by fans, that element of putting the characters into situations and having them react in real human ways is not always popular with fans.
Right.
Because it's counter to what they expect from Star Trek, but necessary to get from where we are now to that future that we've known from the other series.
I think one of the beauties of the episode here is, like you said, getting to know Malcolm more. And I really like that you point out the sorrow and kind of pessimism that he has, and that does take over And the root of why that's there in his life is because he has found himself unable to open up and connect with people. You know, he all the letters he's sending to these women, he talks to Trip, and he confesses that the reason it really didn't work out didn't have anything to do with them. It had to do with him. You know, it's not you, it's me. It literally was Malcolm. And
which may not be true, but he feels that way.
Right. But I think that the show has given us this character, and we've seen this from, you know, when we talk to his parents and he's not close to them, and you know, his siblings don't really feel close to him either. And I think Malcolm confesses something about himself here that being this close to death has allowed him to see, and it will be interesting to chart now. Does Malcolm begin to open up to people more? Does he begin to rectify this situation to which he comes face to face with here when he's looking at death and he's writing these, quote unquote, writing these letters, talking these letters to people? They're all filled with remorse, basically, that he's not closer to anybody than he is now. And I think that's one of the beauties of this, is that this episode gives us a real interesting psychology of a character, and that psychology is something that many people struggle with, the ability to open up. But it also shows us two men who move closer to one another in relationship as friends because of breaking down those barriers, to which there are many men who do find it difficult to share these type of things. Not all men. Some men, you know, they have no problem with sharing their emotions, you know. But you do have some that this is more difficult for. And Malcolm is very much that type of guy. You know, Trip, you know, seems pretty comfortable with sharing his emotions and wearing his heart on his sleeve for the most part. So that's what makes this so fascinating, is putting these two characters together. And I do love that we see that remorse in Malcolm. And I think by the end of the episode, we obviously see characters who, going forward, they're going to be closer friends. And what's great about this is it kind of mirrors the beauty of the relationship between Bashir and O'Brien, where they're two guys who didn't really like each other in the beginning. And by the end of the series, they are kind of best friends. And I think that's a really healthy thing, one, to see. And two, it's one of the reasons why I love their relationship so much here in Enterprise. And this is one of my favorite episodes, because this is where it begins.
Right. Yeah. All good points. And you mentioned, will he begin to change after this? And I think that's a key, is begin to change, because the reality is this is who Malcolm is. So even though he had this experience, he's not going to come back to the ship and like flip a switch and suddenly get close to people easily, right? He can't really do that, but the experience can help push him to start to recognize this in himself and become closer to the crew, because to this point, he has been a rather standoffish person. And you mentioned meeting his parents, as we did a few episodes back during the search for Pineapple. And it's easy to see where growing up in that situation might affect him in this way. It's also interesting in the story to me that he chooses to write to people who he really barely knows when he's on his deathbed, because he isn't really close to anyone. He's these women, the relationships didn't work out, but it's in most cases, I took it to mean these are women he dated. They're not women that he was in 2 5-year relationship, 10-year relationship with, and it didn't work out. These are just, it's Ruby from the 602 Club or people like that. And so he really did not form a lot of close relationships. The other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking is that unauthorized guide that we sometimes reference here on the show, where they write their comments about the episodes, and often we find the comments to be odd. For this one, they once again said, here's another case. They liked the episode, but they said, here's another case where the writers seem to be desperately trying to figure out who Malcolm Reed is. But actually, I don't see it that way at all. I think the writers know exactly who he is, and they're revealing that here. And if anything, maybe Malcolm is trying to figure out who he is and why he feels this way when he's on his deathbed, it would appear.
Mm-hmm.
He obviously has regrets about who he is and his life up to this point. And so, yeah, Malcolm trying to figure out who he is might be a better way of looking at it rather than writers 17 episodes into a series not knowing who their character is, which I think is not the case.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And part of that is because I think this episode harkens back to everything that they've shown us about Malcolm already, and then just builds on that and gives us even more of that. And that's where that regret comes from. And, you know, I think it shows that the writers were paying attention to what they had been doing previously, so that this makes perfect sense with what they give us here for Malcolm. And it's a good reveal. And again, you just come away from this episode like, we already kind of figured we knew who Trip was, but this just accentuates that. But this really lays the cards on the table for who the character of Malcolm is. And, you know, I think one of the things I also really love about the episode, and I'm sure people might roll their eyes at this, but one of the things we see here is that Malcolm's bravado and bluster with the ladies is covering up for his inadequacy that he feels and his inability to feel connected to people.
Right.
And I think that that's something that the show here in this episode really shows us, is that regardless of all these relationships he's had, they've all been hollow because they've lacked the one thing that all relationships truly need, which is the ability to be in harmony with another person, to be emotionally vulnerable with another person, so that you could feel that connection that goes on longer than just anything that pleasure brings. And I think that that's really nice to see here because, yeah, I mean, that life isn't one that's fulfilling. And Malcolm kind of shows that life isn't really one that's fulfilling.
Yeah, exactly. So the other key thing here, we've talked about this in a number of episodes where we see the crew as a whole or members of the crew learning to work together a bit more. What do you think about this episode in terms of that? Primarily, of course, Trip and Malcolm trying to figure out how they might, even though, well, in the end, they do find a way, but they struggle to find a solution, but at least they're starting to work together. And then we talked earlier about Archer and T'Pol and what they've got going on there. But just learning to work together, learning to be Starfleet officers and find a solution. And here we have two very different people. Imagine if this were Archer and Trip trapped in the shuttle pod together. The entire situation and search for a solution and the mood would have been quite different.
Yeah, I you know, Trip is somebody who just, to quote another movie, never give up, never surrender. That's his motto, right? He's
an engineer.
Yeah.
You can always find a solution, right?
Exactly. And he's always going to keep working because, two, it keeps his mind off the inevitable.
Yeah.
Because what else are you going to do? Are you going to wallow or are you going to be busy? And Trip would rather be busy working with his hands. And he and Archer have that in common. And I think that's one of the reasons they're such good friends, is they share a lot of similar interests. But their drive is something that, and determination is something that they both can't let go of. And it is fascinating here because Malcolm on the other side, you know, he realizes, oh, we're probably going to die. And he just kind of gives up, which is a very interesting thing for this character to kind of portray here. Like, and to lay those cards on the table of like, once it seems hopeless, he can't find hope.
Right.
And he calls it realism. And I think, you know, what we've kind of more rightly pegged is it's more of pessimism, because there is still a chance that something can. It's small, it's minuscule, right? If they're really stuck out here by themselves, but it's not to say it couldn't happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about them working together and they find the solution. And I thought the solution was interesting because it's another one of those little nods to the original series that we get in Enterprise. I think of it as the Galileo 1 because it's similar to the solution in the Galileo 7. And it always reminded me of that anyway. So they figure out that they have this idea to jettison the impulse engine, blow it up so that the Enterprise can see it, which is another thing I've seen done in science fiction from time to time. Actually, I'm watching Lost in Space right now, the reboot.
Oh, yeah.
Lost in
It's
Space.
a great show.
And there's a situation in there in the second season where they kind of do the similar thing. They build a fire. They're floating and build a fire to signal the ship. So these things always remind me of the Galileo 7. But so they do that and they find the solution. And, in the end, the Enterprise picks them up. But the one thing we didn't really talk about right now is that Malcolm, so after they find the solution and they get back to the Enterprise and he meets T'Pol there, but it's not quite the same T'Pol that he's met during the situation. She doesn't seem quite as fond of him as she was in his dreams.
Yeah. I think it's very funny because one, the realism of this is, again, I'm sure people might roll their eyes, but who hasn't had a dream about somebody that they're somewhat attracted to? I mean, come on, let's all admit it. It's happened to everyone. But also, too, even just the conversation that happens between Malcolm and Trip, two drunk guys talking about women happens all the time as well. But I do think it's funny because, he vividly remembers that dream. And yeah, it's very different in real life. And I think what was most fun about that scene was actually watching Jolene Blaylock get a chance to play against type there for a second with T'Pol, which is always great when the Vulcan characters get a chance to show that kind of side to them. But I mean, I think, again, all of that kind of gives you an understanding of like who Malcolm is, where he is, and that turns out to be a great way to end the episode when reality is somewhat different than fantasy.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing I found interesting talking about T'Pol here is that Trip has no interest in her whatsoever, but we know that's going to change down the road.
Well, what is kind of fascinating is that there is that thing that Trip deals with is the same thing that we kind of see Archer, is that he sees the Vulcans as Vulcans first and not necessarily is men or women that he can get to know in different ways. And maybe this is the moment where by having that conversation, maybe something does trigger in Trip's mind. But at the same time, too, she's his friend. Like we know now that they know kind of some intimate details about each other's lives. And for him, I think there's that layer to this, which is, I think, really nice that this isn't just something where it's an automatic thing. Like they're growing this relationship between these two characters. And obviously it is going to go somewhere really intense. But right now, I think it's so well done that it makes sense that Trip would kind of feel this way for multiple reasons. And it's very much, it's more true to his character than it would be if he had been like, oh yeah, I've thought of her like that all the time. Like that would just, it doesn't make sense from what we know of who he is and, his experience with T'Pol so far.
Yeah, definitely. At this point in the series, this is what you would expect. Yeah, it's the reaction that is true to the character. And I think it reflects real life, though. There are people that maybe at first you don't hit it off with somebody and then down the road you do. So that's also real life. That's how humans work. All right. Well, any final thoughts on Shuttlepod One? What's your rating for this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult in the sense that I feel like to say anything revolutionary about this episode because it's just so good. And, you know, it really is. And to me personally, I would just, it's 5 across the board. It's a phenomenal episode. It's great character work. Both of the actors here are giving it their all, which is phenomenal. And there is that small little moment that I really kind of love. And it's when Trip and Malcolm are talking about how old Hoshi and Mayweather are. And they're like, oh man, they've ought to be what, only 22, 23 years old. So you get this sense that there is this difference between the age of someone like Trip, who's in his, mid 30s, probably, same thing with Malcolm, and them thinking about the loss of that young life. It really is. It's kind of, it's emotional. It's heartrending. And like, I think it's just one of those small places where the writing is so good in this episode. So yeah, 5 out of 5 for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I also don't have anything revolutionary to say about this episode other than it's one of my all-time favorites. And as I said at the top of our discussion, it just highlights you can do a lot without spending a lot of money. You don't need over-the-top visual effects all the time. And one of the best things that you can do as a writer is to put characters together and let them talk instead of blowing stuff up all the time. So I will
You don't have to blow us up all the time.
I'll give this one 10 bottles of Dorton's best. All right. Well, we would love to hear your thoughts on Shuttlepod One. If you'd like to share those with us, there are many ways to do that. The best way to join in the discussion is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That's our listeners group. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come right on up. If it doesn't, type the whole name, the Babel Conference. It is a closed group, so if you would like to join, please answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum, and I can let you in. If you'd like to send us email, you can do that by going to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form there and choose to send to a show and choose Warp 5, and that'll come to Matthew and me by email. And of course, you can find us in social media. On Twitter, our username is TrekFM. That's also our username on Instagram and everywhere in social media. And we would love to hear from you there. Now, Matthew, when you're not, figuring out what you'd prefer to have as your final meal aboard Shuttlepod One, before you're rescued and you get to see T'Pol looking down at you again, where can people find you?
Well, you could find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero, pretty much any place. If you just type that in, you'll find me. You can also find me here on the network. I'm on the whole other side of the network, the 602 Club, as we talk about all of the fandoms we love outside of Star Trek. Obviously, so much Star Trek to talk about, but so much else to talk about as well. So the 602 Club is the place we do that. You can also find the bonus shows there of Assembling Avengers and Snyder Cuts as well in the same feed. Also, Literary Treks and The Orb. Literary Treks, about the books and the comics of Star Trek. Mention that here on the show. And, of course, Chris, you and I, we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and super excited because as of this recording, we've got some new orbs out for you to check out. So, and we're excited to be back talking about Deep Space Nine. And then last but not least, over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me with Owlpost with Dre Kaufman. That's a Finnish show, talked about all of the Harry Potter chapters in the entire series, one chapter at a time. And then I'm talking Star Wars with my good friend John Mills over on Aggressive Negotiations. Now, Chris, when you're not down in a bottle of whiskey, where can people find you?
You can find me sitting around seeing how long that candle will burn before I run out of oxygen. If you would like to talk Star Trek with me, however, there are many things going on. Of course, on the network, you mentioned The Orb with Deep Space Nine. Just last night, as we're recording this, I published our first new episode of 2022. We're back talking about The Way of the Warrior. We've got new cover art as well, and we're looking forward to discussing DS9 together this year. And we dropped that on the 29th anniversary of the premiere of Deep Space Nine. And that was a great discussion. Of course, I pop in on Literary Treks from time to time. Larry Nemechek and I do the Ready Room now and then, and we have various other things going on. And if you'd like to find me on social media, my username is CBryanJones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y. That's my username everywhere in social media, but Twitter is where I'm most active, and I'd love to hear from you there, talking about Star Trek or college football or Japan or whatever you want to talk about. I'd be happy to chat with you there. Now, if you'd like to help us keep this show and the Orb and the 602 Club, which Ruby would really appreciate, and everything else going, we could definitely use your help through Patreon. To find out how you can help the network and get involved, visit patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm to find out how. And I'd like to say thank you very, very much to everyone who is supporting us right now. We could not keep the network going without you. All right, Matthew. Well, you told me today that you believe that Vulcans are not real, but you'd better get ready for some jazzy Vulcans because they're coming aboard next time as we talk about fusion.
Well, Chris, I do love me some jazz, so let's go.